No one spoke about what happened that night. Not the workers, not the master, not even the town that pretended nothing had changed. But by morning, the plantation was different. The fields were silent. The air felt heavier. Animals refused to cross the gate. And the men who once laughed loudly now kept their voices low, as if afraid something might hear them. They said a scream echoed just after midnight, one long, unnatural sound that seemed to roll across the cotton fields and vanish into the trees. By sunrise, no one could explain what they had seen. Doors left open, footprints leading nowhere, and a house that felt watched. From that day forward, even the bravest men refused to step onto that land after dark. Because whatever happened that night didn't just change the plantation, it claimed it. This is the story of the plantation everyone feared. After one single night, there was a road outside Caldwell's Crossing, Louisiana, that the locals called Mourner's Mile. It ran south from the main highway through a corridor of old-growth oaks, their branches so thickly laced overhead that even in summer, midday light arrived at the ground as something gray and uncertain. At the end of that road sat Bellecroix Plantation. Nobody drove Mourner's Mile if they could help it. Not delivery men, not real estate agents. And there had been a few over the years, optimistic outsiders who saw the colonial-era structure and imagined restored grandeur, boutique hotel profits, wedding venue revenue. They came once, walked the grounds, and filed their paperwork afterward without ever returning. The listing sat dormant, perpetually updated, but never seriously pursued. The locals knew better. They didn't talk about it freely. You had to earn the story, had to be from Caldwell's Crossing, had to have grown up hearing the nighttime warnings, had to understand that some things were not discussed openly, not because they were shameful, but because speaking about them too casually was a kind of disrespect. To the land, to the dead, to whatever still walked between the ruined outbuildings and the main house. Ellie Marsh was not from Caldwell's Crossing. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October with a rental car, a recorder, and a notebook, having driven 4 hours from New Orleans on an assignment for a regional folklore magazine. Her editor had sent her the lead. Abandoned plantation, locals won't go near it, possible story about haunted tourism. And Ellie had accepted it with the mild enthusiasm she reserved for pieces that paid well and demanded little. She had no idea what was about to be asked of her. The first person she spoke to was an old man named Cyprien Turode, who ran a bait shop on the edge of town and who, she was told at the gas station, knew everything about everything going back 100 years. He was sitting outside on a folding chair when she pulled up, whittling something from a piece of pale wood. His eyes squinted against the afternoon glare. She introduced herself, explained her purpose, held out her recorder. Cyprien looked at the recorder for a long moment, then looked at her. "You want to write about Bellecroix," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Any stories you could share would be how long you plan to stay in town." She hesitated. "I was hoping to gather material today and tomorrow, maybe spend one night to get a feel for the atmosphere." "One night where?" "I reserved a room at the motor lodge on Highway 9. He seemed to weigh something, then nodded slowly. "That's fine. You stay on 9. You'll be all right." He set his whittling down on his knee and looked at her with a directness that made her feel uncomfortably, like she was being assessed rather than interviewed. "But you don't stay at Bellecroix. You don't go inside Belcroix after sundown, and whatever you see when you're out there in the daylight hours, whatever you think you see from the corner of your eye, you don't turn around fast, you turn slow. You hear me? Ellie smiled the way journalists smile when they're trying to be respectful of something they don't believe in. I hear you. Can I ask what happened there? Cyprian picked up his whittling again. One night, he said. That's all it took. One night to make that place what it is. The plantation had been built in 1844 by a man named Aldous Bellecroix, the third son of a Creole merchant family with tobacco money and enough ambition to make everyone around him uncomfortable. He had purchased the land, a stretch of low-lying ground near the bayou, considered unlucky by the Coushatta people who had lived there before, and built the main house in 18 months. Then he brought workers, enslaved people, dozens of them, cleared from other estates, bought at auction in New Orleans, separated from families, stripped of names. The plantation was productive. Belcroix was not a man who tolerated inefficiency. He was also, by every surviving account, a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. Not the cold, administrative cruelty of indifferent ownership, but the active, imaginative kind. He had a room at the back of the house. What happened in that room was something the locals did not name directly. They called it the work, as though that was enough, as though it was something that needed to be spoken of only in the most indirect terms to protect both the speaker and the listener. For 16 years, the plantation ran. Then came the night of October 14th, 1860. Nobody outside the plantation knew what happened that night. The first person to arrive the following morning was a supply merchant from town who found the front gate open, the dogs silent, and the main house standing in a stillness that he later described in a written account still held in the County Historical Archive as the stillness of a church after a funeral, when even the air seems exhausted from grief. The merchant walked the grounds. He found no one, not Aldous Bellecroix, not his overseer, not the enslaved people who had been living in the outbuildings, not the household workers, not a single living soul. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture. The breakfast table in the main house had been set for a morning meal that had never been eaten. Eggs in a bowl, bread going stale, a pot of coffee, cold as the autumn morning. Everyone was simply gone. The merchant rode back to town and reported what he had found. A search was organized. Weeks passed, then months, then years. No one who had been at Belcroix Plantation on the night of October 14th was ever found. The land passed through several hands over the following decades, each transfer accompanied by stories of prospective owners who arrived confident and departed shaken. A family from Georgia purchased it in 1897 and lasted 6 days before loading their belongings into a wagon and driving away without explanation. A cotton broker from Baton Rouge bought it in 1923, announced plans to restore and operate it, and was found 3 days later wandering the state highway 4 miles south with no memory of how he had gotten there. By the middle of the 20th century, everyone had given up trying. The parish stopped collecting taxes on it. It sat behind its oaks and waited. Waited for what? Ellie asked. Cyprian looked at her steadily. I reckon that depends on who's walking through the gate. She went the next morning as the sun climbed through a thin cloud cover that made everything look like an old photograph. She brought her recorder, her notebook, and her camera. She drove mourners miles slowly, feeling the temperature change that everyone had mentioned, a persistent coolness beneath the oaks, even in October's lingering warmth, that felt less like shade and more like proximity to something that had never properly thawed. The gate was iron, ornate once, now rusted into a permanent state of half-open. Beyond it, the drive continued another quarter-mile through overgrown grounds. Spanish moss fell from the oaks in long curtains. The grass was high and going to seed. There were crepe myrtles, once planted in formal rows, now sprawling and tangled together, like they had been reaching for each other across some distance. The main house was 2 stories of Greek Revival architecture, white columns, double galleries, a roofline interrupted by dormers that looked in the grey October light like closed eyes. The paint had gone to ash. The lower gallery had partially collapsed on one end, but the bones of the structure were intact, solid in the way things built to impress tend to remain solid long after any reason for impressing anyone has passed. Ellie photographed it from the drive. She photographed the outbuildings, the kitchen house, a crumbling brick structure that smelled of char and age, and the quarters, a row of small structures, now barely more than walls and collapsed roofs, the wood returned mostly to earth, covered in moss and wild ginger. She stood at the entrance to the quarters for a long time and felt something that was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood. Gravity. That was the word. A heaviness in the chest that comes from standing where suffering has been so concentrated that the land itself has retained it, the way certain fabrics hold the smell of smoke long after the fire is gone. She did not go inside the main house immediately. She walked the perimeter first, photographing the rear grounds, where a garden had once been laid out in formal patterns and now existed as a suggestion. The ghost of symmetry in the way certain plants persisted in geometric arrangements, while everything else had grown wild around them. At the back of the property, near the bayou, she found the tree. It was enormous, a water oak easily 200 years old, its trunk the width of a small car. What made her stop was not the tree itself, but what was in it. Carved into the bark at a height that would have been eye level for a person standing at the base was a pattern of marks. Not words in any language she recognized, not symbols she could identify. Just marks, precise, deliberate, covering a section of bark roughly 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, carved with evident care and considerable time. She photographed them from every angle. She stood back and looked at them as a whole and felt the strangeness of their precision, the sense that someone had spent hours here, in this spot, marking something permanent. Later, she would show the photographs to a professor of African diaspora history at Tulane, who would study them for 2 days before writing back to say that some of the marks were consistent with spiritual protective iconography documented among enslaved communities in the Gulf South. The kind of markings that, historically, were made at sites of prayer, sites of burial, and sites where something terrible had been asked of unseen powers. The professor's email ended. I would be very careful about where you publish these. Some things are not ours to circulate. She went inside the house just before noon. The front door had swollen in its frame and required effort, but it opened. The entry hall was wide, floored in heart pine, gone dark with age. A staircase rising at the far end with a railing carved in a pattern of cane stalks. The ceilings were high. There was furniture still. pieces too large or too deteriorated to be worth removing, covered in the dust and decay of over a century of abandonment. She moved through the front rooms carefully, testing each floorboard before trusting her weight to it. The parlor, the dining room, still with its table, still set with the same crockery the merchant had found on the morning after. She stood in the doorway of the dining room for a long moment, looking at the table. The dishes were museum quality now, their arrangement undisturbed for over 160 years, thick with dust. The fact of their stillness, the unbroken tableau of a meal that had never been finished, was more unsettling to her than anything she had encountered outside. She did not touch anything in the dining room. At the back of the house, she found the room. It was at the end of a narrow hallway, behind a door that was heavier than the others, heavier than it needed to be for a room of its size. The door had been locked. She could see the hasp, but the lock itself was missing, and the door swung open at a push. The room was small, 8 feet by 10 perhaps. No window, no furniture. The walls were bare boards, once painted white, now darkened with something that was not only age. The floor had been scrubbed at some point. She could see the grain of the wood worn lighter in a pattern that suggested obsessive, repeated cleaning. A futile attempt at erasure. Ellie stood in the doorway of the room and did not go in. She was a rational person. She believed in history, in documented fact, in the difference between what could be verified and what was only felt. She had covered crime scenes and courtrooms and community grief, and she had always managed to maintain the necessary journalist's membrane between witness and experience. Standing at the threshold of that room, the membrane failed her. It was not sound or vision or anything so concrete. It was a kind of pressure, an accumulated density of human suffering that had nowhere left to go, that had been contained in this small dark room for so many decades that it had become its own atmosphere. She felt it in her sternum, in the backs of her eyes, in the sudden, absolute certainty that she was not alone in the hallway. Though when she turned, slowly, as Cyprian had told her, there was no one there. She backed away from the door. She walked back down the hallway, through the dining rooms, doorway, through the entry hall, and out through the front door into the grey morning air, and stood on the gallery with both hands on the railing until her heart settled. She drove back into town and sat at the diner on Main Street. For an hour, eating soup she barely tasted, writing notes that ran long and emotional and would need to be edited down severely before they were publishable. Then she went back to her room at the motor lodge and called her editor. "I need more time," she said. "How much more?" She thought about the room, about the tree, about the dining room table. "I don't know, 1 more day, maybe 2, her editor agreed. After she hung up, she sat for a while, looking at the photographs on her camera. The house, the outbuildings, the quarters, the tree with its carved marks, and then scrolling back through the images she had taken inside. She stopped. There was an image she didn't remember taking. She had photographed the entry hall upon entering, and then the parlor, the dining room, and the hallway. But there was an image between the parlor photographs and the dining room photographs that she could not account for. It showed the staircase from an angle she was certain she had not photographed. She had been to the right of the staircase when she entered and had not moved left toward it. But the image was from directly in front of the staircase, taken close, angled slightly upward, as though the photographer had been looking up the stairs at something above. At the top of the stairs, In the photograph, there was a shadow that had the approximate dimensions of a standing person. Ellie looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked up what had happened on October 14th, 1860, in every source she could find. There were 3 written accounts: the merchant's record, a letter from the county sheriff's deputy who had led the initial search, and a diary entry from a woman in town, a free black woman named Madeline Rue, who had worked as a laundress and had, according to the diary, known several of the enslaved people at Belle-Croix. Her entry for October 15th, 1860, read only this: "It is done. God in heaven, forgive what was necessary. God in heaven, receive those who were owed." Ellie read the entry 4 times. Then she read it again. "It is done." She thought about the carved marks in the tree, the marks the professor had identified as protective, spiritual, made at sites where something had been asked of unseen powers. She thought about the meal left uneaten on the table, the room at the back of the house with its scrubbed floor. She thought about 16 years and 1 night and 47 people whose names the record books had mostly not bothered to preserve. She thought about the shadow at the top of the stairs. Something had happened on the night of October 14th, 1860. Something had answered what Madeline Rue called a necessity. Something had taken Aldous Belle-Croix and his overseer and left the plantation in that profound silence, that church after a funeral stillness, that the merchant had walked into the next morning. The enslaved people had not been found. Neither had their oppressors. They had all vanished into the same October darkness. But Ellie understood, sitting in her motor lodge room with the photographs on her camera and the diary entry on her laptop screen, that the 2 disappearances were not the same. She felt this with a certainty that bypassed argument. Some disappeared because justice, finally, had reached them. Others, she thought of the shadow at the top of the stairs, the pressure in the hallway, the dining room table untouched for a century and a half. Others had gone somewhere else entirely. She drove Mourner's Mile one final time the next morning at sunrise, with the intention of photographing the tree once more in better light. She stopped at the gate and did not go in. She had spent the previous night reviewing everything she had gathered, the photographs, the recordings, her notes, the historical documents, the professor's email. She had written nearly 6,000 words of draft material. She had the bones of a story that would be, professionally speaking, the best thing she had ever written. But sitting in her rental car at the gate of Belle-Croix Plantation in the early morning light, she found herself thinking not about her career, but about the diary of Madeline Rue. God in heaven, receive those who were owed. There were 47 names. Give or take, the records were incomplete. That she had been able to partially reconstruct through parish records, auction manifests, and the patient archival work of a local historian she had spent most of the previous evening talking to on the phone. 47 people who had been brought to this land against their will, who had suffered in the room at the back of the house and in the fields and in 100 unnamed ways for 16 years, and who had been taken on one October night by something they had collectively called, or permitted, or perhaps simply been received by. The shadow at the top of the stairs was not them. She was sure of that now. The shadow was what remained of Aldous Belle-Croix, or rather, what he had become after justice of an older kind than any courthouse had delivered to him. Trapped in the house, trapped in the dark. unable to leave and unable to cease existing. The plantation he had built as a monument to his own power had become, in the economy of whatever had happened that night, his permanent confinement. The last cruelty, turned inward and made eternal. This was why no one stayed. This was what the buyers and the real estate agents and the cotton broker from Baton Rouge had felt. Not a haunting in the romantic sense, not something that meant them harm, but a presence so saturated with the consequences of its own actions that proximity to it was simply unbearable, like standing next to a fire and feeling not warmth, but the accumulated heat of something that would never go out. Ellie looked at the gate for a long time. Then she turned the car round and drove back toward the highway.